Well, Godzilla vs. Kong is out now, and I already did a video breaking down all the different versions of Kong. So now let's talk about everyone's favorite radioactive dinosaur. Revenge of the Remakes. So for this video, I'm going to be comparing the original 1954 Gojira against the 2014 American Godzilla. And before I get started, let me just preface all this by saying I'm not the biggest Godzilla fan. I mean, I watched a lot of the movies when I was a kid, but I didn't really pay attention to the lore, and I didn't really keep up with it until the 2014 movie came out. And that kind of reignited my interest in Godzilla, because the last time America tried to do a Godzilla movie, it didn't turn out too good. And if you're wondering why I'm not talking about this version, it's just because I have nothing nice to say about it, and it completely misses the point of what made Godzilla interesting or cool in the first place. But all that being said, I don't have the deepest understanding of Godzilla lore, and I know there's a lot of you out there that are really into the Toho Monsterverse, and more power to you, but for the sake of this video and my own sanity, I'm only going to be judging these movies based on what's in the movies themselves, and discounting all the extended lore that both of these movies started with their respective universes. And just so I can tell these movies apart, I am going to be calling the 54 version Gojira and the 2014 version Godzilla, but in both cases I am going to be referring to the monster as Godzilla because that's just what I've called him my entire life, so why change now? So let's dive right into these two Godzilla movies, starting with everybody's favorite part of a Godzilla movie, the human characters. Right, because interpersonal drama is definitely why we come to these monster movies. But even though the human characters aren't what gets us in the seats, both of these movies do a pretty good job at establishing a realistic world where these monsters could exist. So Gojira centers around the family of this professor who discovers Godzilla on this island, and he's a paleontologist, so he immediately wants to start studying it as if the dinosaurs were brought back to life. But him and everybody else quickly realizes that Godzilla is not your typical dinosaur, and he should probably be destroyed or else humanity will be destroyed. So this multinational alliance comes together to try to deal with a threat. Obviously the military is not prepared for the magnitude of threat that is Godzilla, and they have to start looking at alternative options. Luckily the professor's daughter knows a guy with an eye patch who's also a scientist, and he seems to have cracked the code of how to destroy Godzilla. And it's through this new device called the Oxygen Destroyer. And what does it do? Well, I guess it destroys the oxygen content in the water, but instead of turning all the water to hydrogen vapor, the water stays the same, but every living thing in the water dies. But he doesn't really want to use it, not because he agrees with the professor that Godzilla should be captured and kept alive and studied for zoological research. No, he's worried that if this technology were made public, it would become the new weapon of mass destruction. And remember, this is 1954. Everybody in this movie remembers World War II and how Hiroshima and Nagasaki got obliterated by the nuclear bombs. So the debate for whether or not to unleash this new weapon of mass destruction is a really compelling one. And it does a good job to make these human characters more than just ants for Godzilla to step on. And surprisingly enough, the 2014 version takes a similar approach where we spend a lot of time with these human characters, where it again focuses around a family where the patriarch is a scientist obsessed with Godzilla. And this scientist is played by Bryan Cranston, who is trying a lot harder than he probably needs to for a movie called Godzilla. He is acting his heart out in the few scenes that we see him in, and it's really unfortunate that he dies so early in the movie because I would have loved to see him throughout the rest of it, but you know, dramatic tension and stakes and somebody has to die, and Bryan Cranston just got the short end of the stick. And after that, it becomes a debate between duty for your country and spending time with your family for Aaron Taylor Johnson, the son. And Aaron Taylor Johnson does a pretty good job in this movie. We follow his perspective more than most of the other characters because he's constantly putting himself in the thick of all the Godzilla stuff with the military. He's a bomb specialist, and they're trying to fight these monsters with various types of bombs, and that's a very in-demand skill set right now. And when we're not following Aaron Taylor Johnson throwing himself at these monsters from Japan to California, we're following his wife, played by Elizabeth Olsen, and her son trying to survive life in the States with this impending threat from not only Godzilla, but the Mutos. I'll get to them a little later. So you might have noticed that the functionality of both of these casts are a little different from version to version, but that really comes down to the difference in message and tone that each movie is trying to get across. But it is interesting to point out that even though these movies have very different things to say, they both chose to focus on a family unit that's trying to survive this monster attack. And I think that's a really smart and effective approach with both cases. But what are these movies trying to say, and what really can you say with a giant kaiju movie that isn't just, "Let them fight"? Well, surprisingly a lot. It's no secret that the original Gojira was made in response to the birth of the nuclear age. The Japanese were pretty freaked out at the notion that just dropping one bomb could decimate an entire city, and not just decimate it, but make it uninhabitable for many, many years because of the radiation. And the human characters do a great job at expressing that fear and sense of helplessness, while at the same time bringing up surprisingly deep conversations about escalation and responsible use of power. And because of that, the original Gojira is a downer. Not only do we get an extended sequence of Godzilla destroying Tokyo, and then after that we get to see the pain and suffering of the victims that somehow managed to survive. But it's that even though Godzilla does die in the end, one of the few times that we ever actually get to see Godzilla die, the movie ends with a warning to the people in the scene, but also to the audience, that we could unearth another Godzilla if we continue this trajectory of atomic testing and weapons development. And that's a pretty sophisticated way to close out what could be considered a B-monster movie. But now let's lighten things up a little bit with Godzilla 2014. And where Gojira was primarily concerned with fear and caution, Godzilla is primarily concerned with giving the audience a sense of awe and scale to these monsters. And a little bit of fear for good measure. It's not the deepest monster movie that you'll ever watch, but it is impressive how Gareth Edwards gives you this sense of scale and weight and momentum with these giant monsters. And he achieves this by consistently putting the camera at the point of view of the humans witnessing these giant fights. And because of this, we don't get crazy crane shots and overhead shots seeing the battles in all different angles. We get pretty limited angles, but all of these shots either have human characters in the foreground and the monsters in the background, so we have something to compare them to. Or when he does put the camera higher up, it's at an elevation that's accessible to humans. For instance, looking at Godzilla's face out of an office window. Edwards gets really creative with his camera placement, and it helps everything feel a bit more grounded in reality. And while I am by no means an expert on all the Godzilla films, of the many that I have seen, this is the most realistic in my opinion. This movie just made me feel like these monsters were real and occupying the same space as these humans. And it doesn't just create the sense of awe and wonder at the scale of these things, but it also makes all of these scenes a lot more intense because you're looking at it through the lens of someone who's actually there. And through that, you get a real sense of danger. But now let's talk about the thing that we actually watch these movies for. The monsters. Now in Gojira, Godzilla is this giant dinosaur that breathes atomic fire with giant spines on his back that wrecks Tokyo. And even though it's clearly a dude in a giant rubber suit, the model for Godzilla is still pretty intense, and the black and white photography does hide some of the fakeness of it. But am I the only one that thinks the original Godzilla model looks a little goofy? Now, he's not nearly as goofy looking as he will be in later incarnations, but even in the original, there's something about his eyes that don't quite look right. Maybe they're not aligned properly or something, but I don't know, in some shots he looks a little off. But this movie clearly didn't have a huge budget, and it was made in 1954, so I do feel like I should cut them a little bit of slack. They were still kind of trying out the Godzilla character model, but even with the kind of work in progress nature of this design, it's still really strong. There's a reason why this movie sparked not one, but multiple Godzilla franchises around the world. The silhouette of Godzilla is striking and memorable. He's a giant radioactive dinosaur that looks like he's a cross between a Stegosaurus and a T-Rex, and who doesn't love that? And I think Gareth Edwards and company knew this because they didn't change much when it came to Godzilla's design. He still looks like a cross between a Stegosaurus and a T-Rex, still got the spines, and he's still a giant carnivorous lizard. But I guess the only real difference is that one, he's CGI. I'm usually one for practical effects, but in this case, Godzilla is rendered really well, and even though this came out in 2014, a lot of the CGI still holds up, which is something that I can't say for certain attempts at a CGI Godzilla. But aside from him being CGI, Godzilla seems to have put on a few pounds since the last time we saw him. And I still haven't really made up my mind on whether I like this. On the one hand, it makes him look a bit more stable at his massive size, but on the other hand, he just kind of looks bulky and just fat. And because of that, he doesn't look as threatening from a fighting perspective as some of his predecessors were. But 2014 Godzilla didn't just give us a redesigned Godzilla, they actually gave us a brand new type of Godzilla enemy, the Mutos. And these are kind of H.R. Geiger inspired Cloverfield type giant monsters that Godzilla, of course, fights at the end of this movie. And these guys are cool looking, if not a bit forgettable. But it does give Godzilla something to do other than just rampaging through cities. And who doesn't love a giant kaiju battle? Especially when it ends in that fatality. I said it when I came out of the theater in 2014, and I'll say it now. I don't really care that Godzilla doesn't show up a whole lot in this version, because that end fight is just so epic and cool and satisfying, and it's, for my money, the best atomic breath rendering that we've ever had. Even compared to this movie's sequels, the atomic breath has never looked this good. And before I wrap up my final thoughts on both of these movies, there is something about the 2014 Godzilla that I noticed. I don't know if it was intentional, but the more I thought about it, the more it started to make sense. So hear me out. So since the original Gojira clearly painted Godzilla as a representation of American aggression towards Japan at the end of World War II, with nuclear bombs, obviously, which makes sense because it was made in Japan, it's a Japanese perspective on history, and there's a lot of fear there when a bomb can just wipe out an entire city. But with the 2014 Godzilla, I can't help but feel like this Godzilla represents America's fear from the start of World War II of Japanese aggression towards the United States. And again, I don't know if this was intentional, but seeing how Godzilla travels from Japan to Hawaii and then to California, it mirrors how the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and afterwards a lot of Americans felt like they were just going to march on into California and invade the United States. And there was a lot of fear there too. The only problem with this theory is that that was a very real fear that existed in the 1940s, and this movie wasn't made until 2014, and there's a lot of years in between. And I don't think anybody involved in this movie is really afraid of Japanese aggression coming to the United States. But looking back to World War II, the war that inspired Godzilla in the first place, it is interesting to see how Godzilla has been interpreted to represent Japanese fear of Americans, and then possibly Americans' fear of the Japanese. But again, this is all speculation. This is just what I thought watching the movies again and seeing a couple very interesting and harrowing parallels to real life history. And to wrap it all up, I think that both of these movies are good Godzilla movies. They just serve very different purposes. You can watch the original Gojira and feel the palpable fear of nuclear annihilation, or you can watch the 2014 Godzilla and get a sense of the scale and magnitude of these titanic monsters romping through the United States. But now I turn it over to you guys. Which Godzilla do you like better? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. It helps me out. And if you like this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more content, and hit the notification bell to be notified every time I upload a video. And as always, I'm Colby. This is my nerdy talk, and I'll see you in the next video.